We have multiple echoes running at the same time, so we kind of get our roles confused because they're a little bit different on each echo. So Kyle records for our other echo session. Usually we have all these little details hammered out beforehand, but I don't remember what we were all talking about before. All right, well, welcome everybody. We're so excited to have you today. We're really excited for today's session. If you haven't done so already, please enter your name, position, organization, and email, either in the Mentimeter chat or in the Zoom chat. This helps us with our attendance records to share back with our funders on how this project is doing and the reach. And then also we follow up with additional resources at the end of each session. So please share your information with us. We greatly appreciate that. We do have an online platform for anonymous questions called Mentimeter. So if you go to menti.com and enter the code 34999601, that will allow you to submit anonymous questions that will be answered at the end of our session. So we're going to go ahead and get started so that we can be respectful of everybody's time. I apologize, got to get my stuff set up here. So starting with some introductions, we have our Echo Hub team. I'm Krista Opstedal. I am the Project Director of Project Echo at the North Dakota Center for Persons with Disabilities at Minot State. Jody, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jody Patchen, and I am the admin for Project Echo at Minot State.
Thanks, Jody. Kyle?
I'm Kyle Erickson. I'm a research associate here at Minot State.
Thank you. Jessica?
Hi, I'm Jessica Reiswig. I'm project support for Echo at Minot State University, and I also work on the A-STEP and Impact project at Minot State.
Thank you. And Jen from ICI. And
yes, thank you, Krista. Welcome, everyone. So nice to have you. I'm Jennifer Hall-Landy. I work at the University of Minnesota Institute of Community Integration, working to improve the lives of people with disabilities and direct support professionals. And I'm a former direct support professional. Linda?
I'm Linda Anderson. I also work with Jen at ICI. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. And today's speaker is Muna Mohamed. She is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Lifeworks in Minnesota. So go ahead and take it away, Muna.
Hi, thank you, Krista, and to the Echo Hub team for providing me this opportunity to share with you guys on the overall brief understanding of diversity and inclusion. In this session today, we'll talk about how to create an inclusive and welcoming workplace. To the next slide. So a little bit about myself. As Krista said, my name is Muna Mohamed. I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Lifeworks Services. We are a nonprofit organization in Minnesota that supports and partners with people with disabilities. I have a master's in management with an emphasis on organizational diversity and inclusion leadership from the University of Dubuque in Iowa. And I also have my bachelor's of international relations with a double minor in political science and communication studies from Minnesota State University, Mankato. But I also leverage my lived experiences as a Black Muslim woman to allow me to continue to do this work within diversity, equity, and inclusion. During my undergrad, I also worked as a direct service provider, and so I have that lens as well. So this is just a little bit about myself, as you know, what perspective and lens I'm coming from when I am, and throughout my presentation, where my perspective is from. So let's get into a little bit about what we'll be learning here in today's session. So hopefully by the end of the session, you'll be able to clearly define what diversity and inclusion are. And then we'll also explore our identities and see how our identities shape how we view things, our values, and some of the perceptions that we have in the workplace. We'll also take a look at the different biases that exist and how those biases show up at our work. And I'll leave you with some takeaways on how to integrate diversity and inclusion into your organizations. Okay, so what I would like to do is present this poll opportunity for you guys to kind of get an estimate to see what your current organization's diversity state is. So if you think your current organization is diverse, if you use that, in the poll chat, you can either click yes or no, and we'll just kind of get a baseline and see where people are at within their organizations. So I'll give you guys maybe a minute to do that. Maybe less. And then the tool that everyone is using is the meter minute, right? Okay, maybe a couple more seconds for people to chime in and show where their organization is at within when it comes to diverse. Okay, okay, I think we'll progress. So when it comes to diversity, the definition of diversity I like to go by is a very broad definition. So diversity here is the differences among people in respects to age, class, ethnicity, gender, gender expression, health, physical and mental ability, race, sexual orientation, religion, stature, education level, job level and function, personality trait, and other human and social differences. So the reason why I like to use a very broad definition of diversity is because we as humans are so complex and we have different traits and differences that make up who we are as individuals. And so having a very broad general understanding of diversity encompasses all of that. So if you go to the next slide. Another way of looking at diversity is through the different dimensions of diversity. So we have the primary, secondary, workplace, and then style. So in the primary aspect, it looks at the things that we're innately born with. So things like our age, our physical abilities, our race, our ethnicity, our gender, and then sexual orientation. Sometimes this is also referred to as the individual internal aspect of diversity. And then on top of that, we have the secondary, also the external aspect of diversity. Typically, these are the things that we have control over. So what type of level of education we have, the types of, the different languages that we speak, if we're married, if we are parents, again, typically not always within our control, but it's the secondary or external aspect of diversity. And then our workplace diversity has anything to do with the type of organization that we work at, the level of work that we're doing within our organization, maybe the specific department we work for, even in terms of like the shift that we work. And then the overall style is also known as like the personality aspect of diversity. And this encompasses things like what type of a leader are we, what type of work habits do we have, and so forth. So I think grouping it within the different dimensions also helps kind of putting into categories what the differences that we have as humans into, a primary, secondary, workplace, and then overall style. So these are the different dimensions of diversity, and I hope they help you understand what diversity is all about. So if we progress, we'll come back to the next slide. So social identities. So these are also known as like the big 8 of diversity, which is your race, your religion, your ethnicity, your gender, your social economic class, and then your physical and mental abilities. These are referred to as the big 8 because they typically have the most impact on how we're perceived and how we interact with others. They're also known as the social identities because these are, so your race as a social identity holds value in how people interact with you, how you think of yourself, but then also how you think of others, how you interact with others. And then there's a level of expectations that are tied within your race. We'll kind of get into stereotypes and biases later on in the presentation, but I wanted to provide an overview of social identities because it's one thing to say we're different, but then it's not, the differences themselves don't mean anything. It's the value and the meaning we put behind the different social identities that we hold. So for myself as a Black Muslim woman, my different social identities shape how I view things. They really shape and influence how I show up at work and how I interact with my colleagues. So understanding your social identity and what social identities you hold is very crucial. To the next slide. So what I typically like to do is have people, whenever we're talking about diversity and inclusion, is to start off by reflecting on one's own identity. So this is the diversity petal. It really showcases the different layers that make up who we are. So take a couple of minutes to reflect, and it provides a visual way of thinking of your identity. So in terms, like I'll kind of go through and, you know, say how I identify in each, but I also want you to take a minute to reflect on your own individual selves. So, you know, we have me, Muna, the person at the core. My race is, you know, Black. My gender is woman. I am 27 years old. I'm a millennial. I am able-bodied. I'm heterosexual. I am middle class. I have a master's degree level of education, and I'm Muslim. So these different petals or these different layers of who I am, again, will influence how I view things and how I show up in the world. And when it comes to a lot of communities of color or, you know, BIPOC communities that would be Black, Indigenous, or communities of color, it's very easy for us to grow up and know what different identities that we hold. But then on the flip side, a lot of people within the dominant groups, they don't see, you know, being white as an identity. And so therefore they may not think of what their race means or how their race has influenced them growing up. So the starting point in any journey that is within diversity, equity, and inclusion is really having an understanding of who you are. And you can do that by reflecting on your identity. So to the next slide, I shall give you guys a minute to kind of think about your own identities and see, you know, how you classify in each one. Typically, if I was doing this in person, I would have everyone fill out their identities just because I think it really does help starting that conversation, but we'll just have a moment of silence to reflect. Okay, I know we have 30 minutes, so I want to be mindful. I hope that was an overall understanding of like how we identify and it helps you. Because like I said, knowing who you are is the first step in your educational journey. And when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it is a journey because it really is a lot of willing to be taking in and learning new information, but then also unlearning some things, some beliefs that we may hold, some you know, things that we perceive to be as factual or things that we have been programmed to believe, and really unlearning those things. So it's a journey. And I wanted it to, you know, kind of showcase that it is a lifelong journey and you're always going to be learning and unlearning when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. To the next slide. So let's talk a little bit now about biases. So we all have biases. They come in the forms of unconscious or conscious biases. A lot of times when people hear unconscious bias, they think, well, since this is something that, you know, I'm not really it's not within my control because it's an unconscious feeling or thought that I may have, there's not anything I can do about it. But that's not true, because these biases come from someplace. They come from, you know, the experiences and the interactions that we've had in life. And so if these unconscious biases go without being checked, then they're going to continue influencing our judgment. And these biases, how they show up is they're rooted in your preference for or against something. So if you grew up in a predominantly one race community, and so you associate favorable things with that community, then you're most likely going to have a bias that's rooted from that experience. And so you're going to continue favoring that race, and then by that unfavoring or going against the other race. So the unconscious biases that we have, maybe not, you know, they may not be something that fully is within our control because they're unconscious, that's what we're having. But what is within our control is making sure we're checking it and reflecting. A lot of the work within diversity, equity, and inclusion is self-work. It's a lot of taking time to say, hey, where does this specific thought or feeling come from? And always doing that inner work that needs to be done to limit and check your, you know, unconscious and conscious biases. So our preferences that we have, you know, for or against something lead to either favorable or unfavorable biases. So they have an impact on people. So if you have a preference that's unfavorable towards a specific demographic, you know, those things show up at work. They have an effect on your colleagues. If you are in a position of power and have the ability to hire employees, then that is showing up in your hiring practices. So it's one thing to have a thought, but then it also leads to your actions. And so it's something that is having an effect on others. And our biases, you know, again, if they're unchecked, they will hinder our ability to have a diverse and inclusive workplace. So they have real they have real impact, and they jeopardize our ability to really have a welcoming and inclusive community and workplace. We'll kind of go into in the next slide a little bit more about biases as well. So the most common types of biases are affinity bias, perception bias, the halo effect, or the confirmation bias. So we'll get a little bit into more detail with each one. So affinity bias is the feeling or a connection that you have to those similar to us. So I come from the Somali community. With an affinity bias, it would, for me, it would play out as just having a connection, or, favoring someone of a Somali background. And so it's one thing to say, we share a culture and we are of the same, humans are very tribe-like mentalities. So that's one thing, but affinity bias really shows up in, again, positions of power. If I'm, in a hiring position and I pick the Somali candidate because I have the affinity bias towards them, that has a negative impact. And that's, where that bias could show up. So then when we go into perception bias, this is where a lot of that programming that society showcases, a lot of the stereotypes and assumptions that we have about different groups, this is where they come out. And so you may think, for example, all Black people are criminals. And so you may be walking across the street and you hold your purse a little bit tighter, or you cross the sidewalk to get away. But that action comes from a perception bias or a stereotype that you have about Black people. And so that's the action, but it's coming from this belief or this assumption that you have about that individual group. And then also on the positive side, there's also biases that happen on more of a projecting those positive qualities, like the halo effect. So this would be, for example, if there's a common stereotype that says Asians are smart, or they're really good at math, and this is a generalization that's made, but then it's also not factoring in the individual. So an individual colleague of yours may be Asian but not be good at math, but that halo effect, that bias that we have, automatically assumes because they're Asian, they're really good at math. And we think that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing to be good at math, but it's still a very generalizing way of viewing a group of people, and it takes the individual aspect away from them. And then that last bias that shows up is that confirmation bias, where maybe I'll go back to the example that I used with the stereotypes. You see a news article that says African-American male committed a crime and therefore was arrested, and that perception or that bias that you have, then you're like, oh, see, I knew they were criminals, because you now confirmed it with that article. Even if it's true and it happened, that confirmation bias is us going out looking for the specific things. It's not that it's the reality or the truth for all people within that demographic group, but it's us, because of our bias, going out and saying, what examples can I find to reaffirm my pre-existing ideas and beliefs? So these are the different types of biases that exist, and they all show up within our day-to-day interactions with different groups. They show up at the workplace, they show up in our communities. And again, if these biases go unchecked, they will continue to hinder our ability to have more of a diverse and welcoming place of work. So on to the next one. I could really do a full hour presentation on just biases themselves, but I wanted to at least provide that overview. And sometimes people think where our, we talk about biases, but we don't really sometimes address where our biases come from. So the equation I like to go by is that our biases are created by our individual stories. So what's our story? Your story is based off of your background, the lived experiences you have, and that will form your story. So it varies by person to person, because the experiences that I have and how I perceive things as, again, a Black Muslim woman growing up in Southern Minnesota as an immigrant is going to be completely different than the next person. But even within my own community, me being the oldest girl in the family will have a different lived experience and perspective than someone, say, who has the same shared identities, but they grew up as the youngest in the family. So all the different things and different layers that we have as individuals shape our story, and that has an influence on the different biases that we hold and what those biases look like. So to the next slide. So I wanted to provide you guys an opportunity to really reflect on your story. When you think of your life, is there a significant event that happened that you can pinpoint back and say, well, maybe this is where, this specific bias or this specific belief comes from? And while you're thinking, I'm going to go ahead and be very transparent and share maybe an experience that I've had in my life. And through my work of learning what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, I can go back and say, oh, this bias of mine stems from this significant event. So when I was in middle school, again, I said I grew up in southern Minnesota, a very small community that's about an hour south of the Twin Cities. And when I was in middle school, we had a group of white men come to our neighborhood in pickup trucks with American flags on their pickup trucks, chanting and saying that they were the KKK, calling us the N-word, and being very, discriminative and racist, towards us. But in my mind, at the age of 13, 14, I equated pickup trucks with racism. So every time I would see a pickup truck or someone in a pickup truck, I just had an unfeeling, just something uneasy within me that, I think connecting it back to that experience, but then also the bias emerges from equating it to people driving pickup trucks and especially anyone with a pickup truck who had an American flag on their truck. My mind went automatically, this person's a racist, this person does not like, me for the color of my skin or whatever it may be. So that specific event really changed how I viewed the world. Again, growing up in Minnesota, you see pickup trucks, especially in southern Minnesota, a lot. And that's not a fair, accurate depiction of everyone who drives a pickup truck, but that experience came from that event, that significant event that had happened in my life. And it did affect how I perceived people that drove pickup trucks and, how I would interact with them. So knowing what triggers your biases and what specific events had happened in your life is really a powerful opportunity for you to say, okay, I see where it's coming from, but then, you can work on that and say, well, that's, not actually fair for me to assume that entire group or that entire whatever is telling of what that experience was. So again, it's that inner work of seeing where the triggers may be or where it comes, where the starting point may have had been. So I want to give you guys, again, a couple minutes to just, not maybe a minute, we're doing okay on time, to reflect and think of a significant event. But then also when you think of that event, ask yourself these questions on how that event shaped your values or how it made you view the world, how it affected how you perceive others, and then how it also affected your way of interacting with others. So that'll probably be your homework for today, to just kind of think and reflect on your story and that significant event. So we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to now kind of switch from talking about diversity to talking a little bit more about inclusion. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So what is inclusion? So inclusion is an outcome that really focuses on ensuring those that are diverse actually feel and or are welcomed. So you can have diversity without having inclusion, because inclusion, again, is that outcome. And for it to be met, you as the individual, your institution, and your program truly have to be inviting to all. And to the degree that diverse individuals are able to participate fully in the decision-making and the process and development opportunities within an organization or group. So like I said, you can have diversity, you can have a diverse representation within your organization, but it not be inclusive. And that's because diversity builds off of inclusion, but it's not the end all be all. So a lot of times what happens is an organization focuses on recruiting and hiring diverse candidates, but then the work stops there. And then it ends up being a cycle where the diverse employees have some negative experiences. Maybe they're not able to develop, professionally grow within the organization, and then they leave. And then the hiring, HR team, whoever's in charge of the hiring, will go back to the drawing board, think of creative ways to get new and diverse people at the organization. again, work stops there. And so it's that repeated cycle, because the key component that's missing is the inclusion. So if you go to the next slide, it'll kind of showcase what inclusion is. So to know what inclusion is, you also have to know what other options are out there. So the first format is exclusion. This is where you have, say, an organization with the diverse candidates that are like outside of the decision making. They really don't have a seat at the table. They're not part of the overall organization. They're there, but not really. So that's them being excluded from, the key components that are necessary for the organization. And then you have segregation, where there's two sort of conversations going on, one with the dominant group and then one with the diverse candidates or the diverse populations, but they're separate. There's no interconnected work that's going on. And then you have integration, which may look like it's a good thing because they're part of the fold now, but really they're still within their own little bubble. They have their own silo. They're not, again, part of the decision making. They're there, but not really, they don't have a voice, or it's not very, their voice isn't taken into consideration. So the goal is inclusion, where there's only one fold, everyone's in that fold. They are active, full members that are able to contribute fully. And that is the goal of all organizations, because again, without the inclusion piece, you're going to continue going back into that high cycle of hire, burnout, people leave, rehire, back and forth, and you keep in that, a lot of money goes wasted in that cycle without really being intentional or strategic about saying, what is it that we need to do to make sure we have an inclusive and welcoming place of work. So to the next slide. So again, recap, diversity is welcoming, understanding, and valuing different kinds of people. And then inclusion is creating that environment where those diverse people, but also everyone, has the ability to contribute. And it's really an all well-rounded environment where everyone feels like they belong. And you need both. You need to have the diverse people there, where you value different kinds of people, where you have an emphasis on wanting to diversify, but you also have the inclusion piece as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to get there. So what are some steps that you can do as someone within your organization to create that diverse and inclusive workplace? So whenever I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I always say it's something that has to have a long-term strategic approach. It's not a one-off, one-time thing that can be done where you check off a box and think you're going to have really any results that come about from partaking in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So with it being intentional and strategic, you start off like any other initiative that you're pursuing or program that you're putting together. You have to define your goals and see what desired impact you would like to have. So when it comes to diversity, what does that look like for your organization? Is your organization, who's currently at the table, who's missing? And you have to really think of what your desired impact would look like, what success would look like, and then put those into specific, measurable, and attainable goals. So defining your goals, but then also using data, collecting data to identify your gaps and then measure the progress. You cannot, if something's not if you're not measuring an initiative, most of the times it's going to go, there's not really progress that's going to be attained, or it's not really going to have a significant effect, because if you're not able to put numbers behind it, a lot of times in the business world, it's something that's just not, there's no real strategy behind it. And so I always say data is very important in every practice, but especially diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you have to be able to have, identify what it is, what your current state is, where you'd like to be. Every time you put an initiative, you have to measure and see, are you progressing? If not, why not? And really go back to the drawing board and identify different ways to get to your desired goal. And then you develop, using education as a tool. Again, a lot of the work here within diversity, equity, and inclusion is that learning and unlearning. So you have to be able to invest in your employees' educational journeys. So you have to have educational series, trainings, and other DEIA content that really grows your overall organization's competencies around the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And then also implementing different initiatives that will eliminate or address barriers that are in place for your organization. And then having a plan of action to address those key root causes. A lot of times what I see is, organizations will try to have like a copy and paste of other organizations' DEI efforts and think that they can also mimic those efforts and, put it within their organization. But every organization is unique. The specific needs that you have within your organization will differ from another. So it has to be in the best interest of your team, your business goals, and then tying it back to your business goals and not having DEI as like a separate off branch within your organization, and having it be a really an integral part of your organization and business function is key. So this is a brief overview of just some of the steps you can take. Again, it has to be a holistic long-term approach that has a strategy and a purpose behind it. So to the next slide. And if you do that and you're really all in with your diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, some of the benefits that you'll see within your organization, and these are just, again, some of the brief benefits that you'll see, but you'll be able to create a shared experience. You'll have broader perspectives. Not everyone in your team is coming at a decision from one unique lived experience, but you're factoring different perspective from different backgrounds. And so that will automatically provide you a broader perspective, but also a much better sustainable decision-making process. You'll also nurture a more positive workplace. You'll understand your customers better. We, as people who are, direct service providers and the people that we support and serve, if they're coming from a different culture and, your team doesn't reflect that culture, or even differences within your team, it's going to be hard for you to kind of relate and maybe understand what culturally specific programming that they may need. But if you're diverse, your team is diverse, then you'll have better relations and better ways of connecting with your clients and customers. And so that overall will, affect your bottom line as well. But it also add integrity to your team. You'll be able to put action behind your words. You'll be able to generate fresh insights and encourage innovation. And then overall, by really putting an emphasis on inclusion, you'll experience better retention rates as well. So going beyond checking off boxes is the right approach. And then once you put in the work, you'll hopefully be able to start reaping some of those benefits. Next. So when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I always like to say that it's not, yes, it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. It makes good business sense. In the United States, by 2050, we are going to be a minority majority country, which says that, white people will be the minority and that communities of color will become the majority. And so if you want your organization to really mirror the markets that you're serving, you need to be able to put your money and efforts into diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's really going to impact and make you stand out from your competitors. But it also is a way to sustain your work and really stay true to the changing demographics of the United States as well. So yes, that's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. Next slide. Oh, we have made it to the end. I thought I had more. But again, my name is Mohamed. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Lifeworks. I did put my phone and email on there, and I will stay for the end portion for any question and answers. I wanted to be very mindful of time, but I can really talk about this as long as I could. So I appreciate everyone's time. And again, like I said, I'll be back for the Q&A portion at the end.
Thank you so much, Muna. You sharing your story about, some of your biases and where they stem from. I've heard so many times where people kind of dismiss, racism currently because they're like, oh, that was so long ago. But that happened to you 10 years ago, it sounds like. And so I don't know, I had a rock in my stomach listening to that because I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say that it was so long ago, we need to move past it. It clearly is still very much embedded in our society. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And I think to add to that as well, when you think of racism, sometimes we only think of it from like an interpersonal person-to-person level, and we forget like there's the systemic institutional racism that still exists and has really negative a negative impact and negative outcomes for people of color. So I think the more you peel back the layers and look into it, the more you'll learn and see that it's not an issue of the past, but it's still something that's ongoing and that's being dealt with as we speak. But the more we bring awareness to it, the more we can actively work against it. So thank you.
Yeah, if you could provide us any resources on like what is systemic racism in case people haven't heard that term before or don't really know like how deep rooted it is into our capitalistic society, that would be great because we do provide resources at the end of each session. So that would be really great if you could provide some links. I appreciate it.
I'll connect with you, Kristen. I'll send that to you so you can forward on to everyone. But yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to our case presentation today, and then we'll answer some questions at the end. So please feel free to use Mentimeter to submit any questions that you have. I do see some loaded up here, so we would love to hear more from the audience. So today's presentation does come from one of our participants who asked to remain anonymous. They put together a presentation about the impacts of microaggressions that they've experienced in the workplace. And thank you to who provided this information to us. So what are microaggressions? The standard definition for a microaggression is a verbal or nonverbal slight, indignities, insults, put downs, and invalidations that people from a marginalized community experience in their day-to-day interactions. There's different types and forms of microaggressions. Microaggressions can be intentional or unintentional, but regardless of intent, these words or actions are often rooted in implicit bias. So one form of microaggressions is microassaults, which are deliberate and intentional slights or insults that are meant to hurt the intended victim through name calling, avoidant behavior, and purposeful discriminatory actions. There's also micro-invalidation, which is when somebody attempts to discredit or minimize the experience of someone from an underrepresented group. And third, there is micro insults, which are rude, insensitive comments that subtly disrespect a person's racial heritage or identity. So how we may see microaggressions pop up on the job, very rarely do individuals have the intention of discriminating against or harming someone. However, that doesn't mean that using microaggressions on purpose doesn't occur. People who deliver microaggressions often express that they don't intend to be offensive. If this is the case, then there you can start having a conversation around intent versus the impact that microaggressions may have. So here's some microaggressions that our case presenter has experienced as a Native American woman. She's had people tell her that you're not like them, you got your education. People have told her she looks more Native with her hair straight, that they don't see color. When she was telling a story about having an intersected identity, somebody butted in and said, I know what you mean, being the only woman in this context. One time she was trying to address how it was inappropriate for people to have teepees in bedrooms or headdresses on shirts if they weren't Native American. She heard somebody say, don't be so sensitive, it's just something fun for kids. People have asked her if she goes to school for free or if she's paid taxes. And one time when she gave a specific name, such as Shane Lone Bear, the person responded, oh, they must be from this reservation. And she wanted to know that Indigenous people live everywhere, including in cities. And as I was reading through all of these, I reached out to our case presenter and I asked him, how have these microaggressions impacted you. So she followed up and said, how do I feel when I hear these comments week after week from coworkers and friends? It's as confusing as it is hurtful to hear these comments. On one hand, I want to stand up for myself and say at that moment, and say something at that moment. But if I speak out of emotion and my words are too sharp, then will I be perpetuating the stereotype of an angry Indian? But if I don't say something, how will they know that these comments make me feel unwanted in spaces that I should feel safe? We like to think that sharing our culture helps gain a greater understanding, but it also gives people more ammunition. I question if people's biases is truly towards my culture or if it's me. Is it personal, or am I doing something that caused this negativity to be brought on? I've worked very hard to get where I'm at professionally and personally. And when I'm surrounded by these comments, I question my worth and value in these spaces that I'm in. It makes me consider removing myself from these spaces when it gets out of hand. Sometimes that means physically, other times emotionally and mentally. So she provided some ways to respond when you do encounter microaggressions in the workplace. One, you can stop, hit pause on the interaction and assess the situation. This could mean deciding whether or not to address it right then and there, or recognize the need for time to process and decide what actions to take next. Another strategy could be to talk it out. What could possibly be said in the context of that scenario right then and there? Whether it's addressing what just happened or defusing a situation until a safer opportunity arises to address it. And also seeking out support when you're debriefing the situation and asking others for how to respond to situations, or if it's even best to respond to that situation. And when I was talking to the case presenter, we kind of realized that these interactions are kind of hard to catch in the moment sometimes. I had recently had a conversation with a coworker and heard a microaggression, and at the time I didn't feel comfortable with it, but also I kind of noticed that their demeanor changed a little bit, and then I was like, well, it was said in a very joking manner. Is this like an inside joke between these two people? I don't know. So I didn't do anything. I kind of stood there and just sat in the very much uncomfortableness. But then afterwards, checked in on that person, asked them how they were doing and how it impacted them. And this is a way to create that safe space to help that person feel respected, disrespectful happens to them. So they wanted to leave us with this quote: microaggressions add up. No matter how confident people from marginalized or underrepresented communities feel about their identities, microaggressions create unsafe spaces and make individuals feel like perpetual outsiders. So it looks like we have some questions for Mona, if you're willing to answer that. And if you have any follow-up on that case presentation. I feel kind of weird speaking on behalf of the participant, but also I wanted this to be a safe space for them. So please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, you could probably do an hour to 2 hour presentation on microaggressions, because like you said in the final quote that you shared, that they do add up. It's not a one-time thing. It's the little jabs that happen here and there. And then you start to question, like, am I worthy of being here? Am I, did I earn my spot? I remember, so I worked at a community college, and we had a chance to meet with our chancellor. And so I was invited to one of those opportunities to, engage and meet with him. And a colleague said, well, I was there because of diversity, that I was invited to the meeting because of the diversity aspect of it. And I remember I didn't say anything in the moment. I went home and it just sat with me. It was a constant thought of like, why would that be the first thing that comes to your mind, and not how hard I work at my job, how qualified I am, how I show up every single day, and I have, all these relationships that I've built with business partners, and I'm actively recruiting because I was in admissions, and all the things that I brought to the team. But that all got pushed aside, and it was, oh, this looks good on our college because I'm the one, employee of color that they had, which said more about them than me. But yeah, it does definitely add up. So So, okay, let me answer this question. How has your organization benefited from having a diverse workforce? So I'm still fairly new in my role with Lifeworks. I've been in that role for 6 months. But just right away, one of the things that we did was really looking at the people that we serve and, examining where we're at. And it's predominantly people from white communities. Although Minnesota is very diverse itself, we didn't have a lot of people served that are coming from different communities. So we put together an approach to really co-create culturally specific programs. And that's one of our strategic pillars, to connect with communities of color and not only ask what is it that they need, but also really extend that connection and that's, connection to what resources and services that we have. So one of the things that I did was put together a listening session for the Somali community, and that's the approach that we'll be taking with other communities as well, starting with the listening session, really hearing from individuals themselves of what it is that they need, going back with the information, and then putting forward programming and services that tailor to their specific needs as a culture and as a community. So on our service side, that's the work that we've been doing. In terms of diverse work, employee wise. Also, I think once the people served are diverse, it's also gonna spread the word and showcase that, this organization is an organization to work for because they maybe heard from a loved one, or you have that connection on a personal level. So I think it all goes in together, whichever approach you start with. If you start with one realm, it's going to have an effect on the other side as well. So we still have a lot of work to do within our organization, but I think the key component that I like about Lifeworks and where we're at so far is that the acknowledgement is there and that everyone is on board to do the work. Certain population. How does one change it? I think the fact that you are at the place now to have acknowledged it and understand the why, it's going to take intentional work to figure out what it is that needs to change. So identifying, now that you've identified the problem, it's really taking that next step to expose yourself to different information. The really good thing about us living in a technology, where the internet is very accessible and we have a lot of information at our fingertips. There's a lot of documentaries, educational series, and a lot of content that's out there without knowing the specific, community or, what bias that exists for this individual. I can't really pinpoint you on a specific place, but I would just start looking. I would just start researching and seeing what information is out there, and then being comfortable with being uncomfortable. That is key, because you will never get to a place of acknowledging and doing making amends to those past experiences without putting yourself out there and being willing to experience some discomfort. I like the philosophy of courageous conversations is what sometimes they're called, but it's really engaging in conversations where you're very direct. You ask the questions and you have that back and forth with someone of a different background. And the more that happens, the more comfortable you get and the more you kind of get over that bias. And yeah, it takes intentional work, but it's a process. So I would just say continue working through it, but you're at a good place where you're acknowledging it.
Thank you for those questions. If anybody has any others, please feel free.
Krista, I'll ask you a question because I always go to the practical practical things. So first of all, for those of you not from around the Twin Cities, Lifeworks is a really, really fabulous organization. So I'm happy Muna can come because they do good work. So I'm sure Lifeworks, like the rest of everybody who's doing direct supports, has just an incredible staff shortage and everybody's stretched really, really, really thin. How are you sort of in practical ways helping people, like, because I know what happened, you already just like, I was like, oh, just one more thing I have to do. I don't have time for this. Like, how are you figuring out how to help people weave this into their daily practice in a way that builds on everything and makes, I can't get my words out.
Kind of get that buy-in, right?
Yeah, to get that buy-in and helping people realize that in the long run, it's going to pay off. And it's not just one more thing I have to do today to get my work list done, but it's really in the long run going to make the workplace work better and may actually solve some of the direct support work problems. If you have a wider range of people you can choose from to hire, that it's worth the effort, even if you're feeling sort of really overwhelmed at the moment because there's no staff to do anything. So it's kind of how's Lifeworks kind of thinking about that and handling that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, because it's like, what comes first? Like, do we invest in the work now where, we do have like other organizations staffing shortages, and that's like a really big priority. But I think with Lifeworks, and which I'm, very thankful for, like coming in, a lot of the foundational work was already done. So I didn't have to come and really create it or develop it. So the approach that they've been taking throughout their leadership is that everyone has to commit to the DEI initiatives, and the buy-in was kind of already there. So the value added from having diverse perspectives and pursuing these initiatives, I think those that did the previous work that I'm, now picking up the work after, created those spaces where they got people to buy in. And so I haven't had a lot of pushback on why should I prioritize this when I have, so many other things on my to-do list. But for an organization who's probably just starting off, where maybe those conversations are emerging, I would say, just like any change within an organization, you need the buy-in. You definitely, I don't like the approach of coming in and just saying, well, this is what you have to do. And it's just that I think, and maybe it's because growing up, I was always one of those people that asked why. I needed someone that's convinced me why before I was fully on board. And I think that's, as humans, I think we owe that to our employees and our teams. So I would probably start off with maybe like a general, what is diversity and inclusion? What benefits do we get from pursuing this? And then really having a little bit of wiggle room for staff to, get on board. And, maybe it's within DEI work, you're going to have the same conversations over and over, because something that may be like, oh, natural you pick up on for one person is not the same for the other. So it's that constant reassurance of like, yes, if we do this now, think of, a year from now, 2 years, where we'll be. So having those regular conversations, and then celebrating the small wins, like whenever you do have a win, being able to say, because of this initiative that we embarked on, this is the results that we're seeing. And so yeah, it's a give and take, you supporting your staff, making sure that you're available for them, but also having them on board and knowing that, this is something that maybe is a little work now, but long-term will pay off and benefit the organization overall.
Sounds like leadership is a really, really, really key factor.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And it starts for us, even like our leadership did all the DEI training first. So it wasn't, they mirrored and, really were like a role model for like their teams, and to showcase like, I went through all this, now it's your turn. And it's not saying, you as a DSP have to do all this work on top of your full-time load, and me as the executive will not have to embark on any of that. So it's a really top-down approach. Thank you. Good question. Anyone else? We have a couple more minutes. Just for me to know, I'd like to know, is this maybe like is this the first DEI training presentation that any of you have ever gone to? Okay.
Maybe we can use the raise hand feature in Zoom. If you go to reactions or thumbs up,
Yeah,
if this is your first time. Just scroll through. I'm
That's
not
good.
gonna lie, I was kind of surprised by the initial poll.
Okay, thank you. With the results for the first poll, you said?
Yeah, and I mean, we only had a handful of people respond, so who knows, it could have all been from the same agency, but I was not expecting that many no's, honestly. Well,
Yeah.
thank you guys so much. Please take a moment to fill out our survey and let us know. Oh, accommodations. Oh, I apologize. We have one question here that somebody just submitted.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Because I'm coming from the lens of usually the one who has that microaggression geared towards. But as like someone who is white and, you know, who has the ability to play the role of an ally, I would say, you know, probably speak up, because it takes a toll on the individual. And maybe in that specific instance, they don't have, maybe not that they don't have the ability, but they just choose to not respond. So if you could kind of take that off of their shoulders and be the one that vocalizes it and says, you know, hey, that's not appropriate, or, you know, whatever the specific circumstance is. But I think you speaking up also, you know, really does diffuse the situation. It showcases that you're, you know, on the same side, you're willing to, again, take that off their shoulder. But even if in the moment it's not maybe something that you have the comfort level to speak up, I would say maybe later we'll still check with them, because I think still that reassurance of knowing a teammate saw that microaggression, and it's not just you, because a lot of times we're within our head playing like, you know, am I overthinking it? Is this really like, you know, we're having that inner struggle. So I'd say maybe connecting back with them at a later point too, just, you know, giving them the reassurance, seeing you saw what was said, or you know, you heard what was said, and that, you know, you're there for any, you know, support as needed. I hope that answers that. Perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Muna. We really, really appreciate this presentation. Same with Jessica. I've been to a couple DEI sessions, but definitely learned a lot from this one. So thank you so much. And it's really exciting to see an organization that also comes from that disability background too. To me, that was just a gem to find. So thank you, Linda, for sharing Muna's contact information.
Thank you.
So please, like I said, take time to fill out our survey. We did put a link in the chat. I can probably paste it again. We do take your thoughts into consideration in future sessions. And also, if you are hoping to get CEUs for the session, we do require that you fill out the surveys to receive those credits. So thank you, everybody. We hope to see you at our next session, which will be on March 29th, and it's going to be on mindfulness featuring Miss Linda Anderson.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Muna.
Thanks. Bye-bye.